QWERTY keyboard layout. The QWERTY keyboard layout is one of the most persistent technological decisions in modern history. It was created in the 1870s by Christopher Latham Sholes, an inventor working on early typewriter prototypes. At that time, typing was a mechanical process. Each key was connected to a metal arm that struck an inked ribbon to imprint a letter onto paper. When adjacent arms were activated too quickly in succession, they collided and jammed the machine. This was not a rare inconvenience but a fundamental design limitation of early typewriters. Sholes and his collaborators rearranged the alphabet deliberately. Contrary to popular belief, QWERTY was not designed to make typing faster. It was designed to reduce mechanical conflict. Frequently paired letters in the English language were separated across the keyboard so that the metal arms would not clash. The layout slowed the typist slightly, spacing out common sequences and allowing the machinery to recover between strokes. In this context, inefficiency was a practical solution. When the Remington Company began mass-producing typewriters in the late 19th century, QWERTY became part of a commercial standard. Typists were trained on this configuration. Businesses invested in equipment built around it. Instruction manuals, typing schools, and office procedures reinforced its dominance. By the time alternative layouts were proposed, including more ergonomically optimized systems such as Dvorak in the 1930s, QWERTY had already become deeply embedded in professional culture. The persistence of QWERTY illustrates a phenomenon known as path dependence. Once a system gains widespread adoption, the cost of changing it becomes greater than the cost of tolerating its imperfections. Companies would need to retrain employees. Educational institutions would need to revise curricula. Manufacturers would have to redesign hardware. Individuals would have to relearn a skill built into their muscle memory over years of repetition. Even if a superior layout exists in theory, the transition itself becomes an obstacle too large to justify. With the arrival of electronic keyboards, the original mechanical problem disappeared entirely. There are no metal arms to jam on a laptop or smartphone. Keystrokes are electrical signals, processed instantly without physical collision. The foundational reason for QWERTY's design no longer applies. Yet the layout remains almost universal across devices and languages, shaping how billions of people interact with digital information every day. QWERTY's survival is not a testament to optimal design but to historical momentum. It demonstrates how technological ecosystems stabilize around early compromises. What begins as a workaround for mechanical fragility evolves into a cultural norm. Over time, users forget the origin and assume inevitability. The keyboard becomes invisible, perceived as a natural interface rather than a historical artifact. There is also a cognitive dimension to its endurance. Humans adapt remarkably well to constraints. Once trained, the brain internalizes spatial patterns and motor sequences. The arrangement of keys becomes embodied knowledge. Changing it would require not only intellectual adjustment but physical retraining. This embodied familiarity reinforces the status quo more effectively than any formal rule. In contemporary life, the QWERTY layout extends beyond physical keyboards. It appears on touchscreen devices, virtual interfaces, and even public kiosks. The design has detached from its mechanical ancestry and entered the realm of digital convention. It persists because it is shared, recognized, and predictable. Standardization ensures interoperability across borders and industries, reducing friction in communication. The story of QWERTY is therefore not merely about typing. It is about how early technical constraints can shape generations of behavior. It reveals how infrastructure, education, and habit intertwine to preserve systems long after their original purpose fades. In a world defined by rapid innovation, the keyboard beneath our fingertips remains a quiet reminder that progress often builds upon compromises we no longer remember. The floppy disk save icon. The floppy disk save icon is one of the most recognizable symbols in digital culture, yet it represents an object that has largely vanished from everyday life. For millions of people using modern computers, the small square image in the corner of a screen does not correspond to any lived memory. It is a symbol detached from its material origin, preserved long after the technology it depicts became obsolete. The floppy disk emerged in the 1970s as a portable storage medium. Early versions were large, flexible magnetic disks encased in thin plastic sleeves. By the 1980s and 1990s, the 3.5-inch floppy disk became the standard format. It was compact, rigid, and capable of storing documents, software, and personal files. For a generation of computer users, saving a file meant physically writing data onto this removable device. The action had a tangible counterpart: inserting the disk, hearing the drive spin, and removing it once the operation was complete. When graphical user interfaces became widespread in the 1980s, designers needed intuitive icons to represent actions. The floppy disk was chosen to symbolize save because it was already associated with preservation and storage. The image was simple, geometric, and easy to render at small sizes. Most importantly, it reflected a concrete reality. Clicking the icon mirrored a physical process users understood. As technology evolved, storage shifted from removable disks to internal hard drives, optical media, flash memory, and eventually cloud-based systems. The floppy disk's limited capacity, measured in megabytes, quickly became insufficient for modern software and multimedia files. By the early 2000s, most computers no longer included floppy drives. Production declined, and the device faded into technological history. Yet the icon remained. The persistence of the floppy disk image demonstrates how digital symbolism can outlive physical reference. In interface design, consistency is crucial. Once users associate a specific symbol with a specific action, changing it introduces friction. Designers are often reluctant to replace established icons because familiarity reduces cognitive load. Even when the original meaning becomes obscure, recognition continues to serve its purpose. Over time, the floppy disk icon transformed from representation to abstraction. For older users, it still evokes memory: a small plastic square with a metal shutter and sliding tab. For younger generations, it functions purely as a signifier of saving. The image no longer needs to correspond to experience. Its meaning is learned through repetition within software environments. This evolution reflects a broader principle in technological culture. Symbols often persist because they anchor continuity across waves of innovation. They provide stability in an environment of constant change. The floppy disk icon connects modern cloud storage systems, vast networks of remote servers, to an earlier era when data was fragile, localized, and physically transferable. There is also a subtle psychological dimension. The act of saving once carried weight. Storage was finite. Files could be lost if not deliberately preserved. The floppy disk represented control over information. Today, autosave features and cloud synchronization operate silently in the background. Data often persists without conscious intervention. Yet the icon remains as a ritual gesture, a visible affirmation that something has been secured. In many applications, users rarely need to click save at all. The system records changes automatically. Still, the symbol appears in toolbars and menus, reinforcing a habit formed decades ago. It offers reassurance through familiarity, even if the underlying mechanism has fundamentally changed. The floppy disk save icon is therefore more than nostalgic decoration. It is a cultural fossil embedded in digital infrastructure. It reminds us that modern interfaces are layered with history. Beneath sleek screens and invisible servers lie design decisions shaped by earlier limitations and user expectations. What survives is not always what is technically necessary. Sometimes it is what is recognizable, stable, and collectively understood. The floppy disk icon endures not because we still use floppy disks, but because we once did, and that shared memory continues to structure the way we visualize preservation in the digital age. The CC in email. The abbreviation CC in email stands for carbon copy, a term that originated long before digital communication. Its roots lie in a physical method of duplication that was once essential to business and government correspondence. Carbon paper, thin sheets coated with a layer of pigment, was placed between two pieces of paper inside a typewriter. When the top sheet was typed on, pressure transferred ink onto the sheet beneath it, creating an exact duplicate. This allowed multiple copies of a document to be produced simultaneously, without rewriting the text. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, carbon copies were fundamental to administrative work. Offices relied on them to maintain records, share information across departments, and document agreements. A letter might be sent to its primary recipient, while additional carbon copies were filed internally or forwarded to other relevant parties. The notation CC would be typed at the bottom of the letter, followed by the names of those who received duplicates. It served both as acknowledgement and transparency, indicating who else was included in the communication. When electronic mail systems were developed in the late 20th century, designers faced the challenge of translating familiar office practices into digital form. Rather than invent entirely new terminology, they adopted language that users already understood. CC migrated seamlessly into email interfaces, preserving the logic of shared correspondence. Typing an address into the CC field replicated the traditional act of distributing additional copies, though no physical paper was involved. The endurance of this term reveals how digital systems often inherit structures from the analog world. Early email platforms were built primarily for corporate and academic environments, places where formal correspondence and hierarchical communication were already established. Retaining familiar terminology reduced confusion and facilitated adoption. Users transitioning from paper-based offices to computer terminals could rely on recognizable conventions. Over time, the meaning of CC subtly expanded. In physical correspondence, creating a carbon copy required deliberate preparation. There was a tangible awareness that additional recipients were being included. In email, adding someone to the CC field requires only a few keystrokes. The action is effortless and the scale can be far greater. A message can be copied to dozens or even hundreds of recipients instantly. This ease has transformed communication dynamics. The CC field has become a tool for documentation, oversight, and sometimes strategic signaling. Including a supervisor in CC can imply accountability. Adding colleagues can distribute responsibility. What was once a mechanical duplication process now carries social and organizational implications within digital networks. The term BCC, meaning blind carbon copy, also originates from the same era. In traditional correspondence, a blind carbon copy was produced without the primary recipient's knowledge. In email, BCC performs a similar function invisibly, allowing recipients to be included discreetly. The terminology persists even though no carbon paper is involved, and the duplication process is purely electronic. Today, many email users have never seen carbon paper or operated a typewriter. The material practice that gave rise to CC has nearly disappeared from daily life. Yet the abbreviation remains embedded in interfaces across platforms and devices. It appears on smartphones, webmail clients, and enterprise systems alike, a small textual artifact bridging centuries of communication technology. The continued use of CC demonstrates how language can outlast the physical conditions that created it. It also reflects the conservative nature of communication design. Once a term becomes standardized across software ecosystems, replacing it would risk confusion without delivering meaningful benefit. Familiarity reinforces stability. In a broader sense, CC illustrates how digital culture is layered upon older administrative traditions. Email did not emerge in isolation. It absorbed the vocabulary and structure of the office. Even as communication accelerates and expands globally, subtle traces of carbon paper remain in the abbreviations we type each day. The medium has transformed completely, but the terminology endures, carrying with it the memory of ink pressed between sheets of paper in a quieter, more mechanical age. The pound sign, hashtag. The pound sign, represented by the symbol hashtag, is one of the most adaptable characters in modern communication. Its meaning has shifted repeatedly across centuries, accumulating new functions without fully discarding the old ones. Today, it is widely recognized as the hashtag, a marker that organizes information across social media platforms. Yet long before it became a digital tool for categorization, the symbol served practical roles in commerce, printing, and telecommunication. The origins of the pound sign trace back to medieval scribes who used a stylized abbreviation for the Latin word libra, meaning weight or balance. Over time, this abbreviation evolved into a crossed double-line symbol used to denote pounds as a unit of weight. In English-speaking countries, it became associated with measurements, especially in trade. Merchants and accountants used it to indicate quantities measured in pounds, reinforcing its connection to commerce and record-keeping. By the 19th century, the symbol had found a stable place on typewriters. It was commonly referred to as the number sign in the United States, because it was placed before a numeral to indicate an item number. Writing #5 signified number 5. In other contexts, particularly in accounting, it retained its association with weight and was called the pound sign. The name varied depending on usage, but the symbol remained visually consistent. When telephones adopted push-button keypads in the 1960s, engineers included the hashtag symbol alongside digits and the asterisk. Its function was not linguistic but operational. It served as a control key within automated telephone systems, allowing users to confirm input or navigate menus. The symbol's inclusion was partly practical. It was visually distinct, easy to press, and already present on typewriter keyboards, making it familiar. For decades, the pound sign existed as a minor but stable character within technological systems. Its meaning was context-dependent but rarely transformative. That changed dramatically in the early 21st century with the rise of social media. In 2007, users of Twitter began placing the hashtag symbol before keywords to group conversations around shared topics. The practice was informal at first, emerging from user behavior rather than corporate design. Over time, platforms recognized its utility and formally integrated hashtags into their systems. With this shift, the pound sign acquired a new identity. It became a tool for categorization, discoverability, and digital community formation. A simple prefix transformed ordinary words into searchable links. The symbol's function expanded from marking quantity or controlling machines to structuring vast flows of online information. In this context, the visual simplicity of hashtag proved advantageous. It was already embedded in keyboards and did not require new software conventions. The transformation of the pound sign into a hashtag illustrates how symbols can gain new meanings through collective use. No redesign was necessary. The character's physical form remained unchanged. Only its cultural interpretation evolved. This adaptability ensured its survival and relevance across radically different technological environments. Today, the hashtag symbol coexists in multiple semantic layers. It still denotes numbers in some contexts. It remains a control key in telecommunication systems. It appears in programming languages, where it may signal comments or directives. At the same time, it functions as a marker of trends, movements, and shared identity online. Few symbols operate simultaneously in so many domains. The endurance of the pound sign reflects the cumulative nature of communication systems. Rather than replacing older conventions entirely, new technologies often repurpose them. The symbol's journey from medieval manuscript to global digital network demonstrates continuity beneath apparent disruption. Each era adapted it to its needs without erasing prior associations. In everyday use, most people rarely consider this layered history. Typing a hashtag feels immediate and intuitive. Yet embedded within that gesture is a lineage extending through trade ledgers, mechanical typewriters, telephone keypads, and early internet forums. The pound sign endures because it has proven flexible, capable of absorbing new functions while retaining its recognizable form. It stands as a quiet example of how symbols persist by evolving, carrying fragments of past meanings into the architecture of contemporary communication. Why we say hang up the phone. The phrase hang up the phone belongs to an era when ending a call required a physical gesture. It reflects a time when telephones were mechanical devices mounted on walls or resting on heavy bases, and the act of disconnecting was literal. To hang up meant exactly what the words describe, placing the receiver back onto a hook that completed or broke an electrical circuit. In the earliest telephone systems of the late 19th century, devices were typically fixed to walls. A separate receiver was attached by a cord and rested on a protruding switch hook when not in use. Lifting the receiver signaled the exchange that a call was being initiated. Placing it back onto the hook physically interrupted the circuit, terminating the connection. The action was visible, audible, and tactile. The weight of the receiver pressed down the switch, making a distinct mechanical sound as the line disconnected. As telephones evolved into desk models in the 20th century, the basic principle remained. The handset rested in a cradle. When the call ended, the user returned the handset to its base. Although the design became more compact and aesthetically refined, the mechanical function persisted. The phrase "hang up" remained accurate because the essential movement, returning the receiver to its resting position, continued to break the connection. Language formed around this repeated gesture. People did not simply end calls. They hung up. The phrase entered everyday speech and gradually detached from the specific physical apparatus that inspired it. Even as telecommunication systems advanced, the vocabulary remained stable. The introduction of cordless phones and mobile devices fundamentally altered the mechanics of ending a call. There was no hook, no cradle, and no physical interruption of an exposed circuit. Pressing a button achieved the same result electronically. On smartphones, tapping a red icon disconnects the call through invisible digital signals transmitted across wireless networks. The mechanical switch hook disappeared, replaced by software commands and radio waves. Yet the phrase endured. This persistence illustrates how language often outlives the technologies that generate it. Words formed in one material context can survive transitions into entirely different technical environments. Hang up no longer describes a literal action, but it continues to communicate a familiar conclusion. Its survival is partly due to habit and partly due to clarity. The phrase is concise and universally understood within English-speaking cultures. There is also a deeper continuity at work. Although the mechanism changed, the conceptual action remained the same. Ending a connection. The metaphor of hanging something up suggests closure and finality. It conveys the idea of returning an object to rest. Even when no object is physically involved, the metaphor retains expressive power. Telecommunication has progressed from manual switchboards to automated exchanges, from analog signals to digital packets traveling through fiber optic cables and satellites. The scale and speed of communication have expanded beyond what early telephone users could have imagined. Despite these transformations, fragments of early mechanical experience persist in everyday speech. The phrase also reflects how infrastructure shapes language subtly and permanently. Millions of people repeated the gesture of hanging up a receiver across decades. Children observed their parents performing it. The action embedded itself in cultural memory. When new devices eliminated the need for the gesture, the linguistic pattern remained because it was already normalized. In contemporary life, most calls are ended with a tap on a screen. There is no sound of a receiver settling into place, no visible switch being depressed. The termination is silent and instantaneous. Still, we describe the moment as hanging up. The words serve as a reminder that communication technologies, however advanced, are built upon layers of earlier design. The endurance of hang up demonstrates how language carries historical residue. It preserves the outline of an older world within modern speech. Even as devices become lighter, smaller, and more abstract, the vocabulary formed around their predecessors continues to frame our experience. The phrase remains not because it is technically accurate, but because it connects present action to a long continuity of human communication. The 9-to-5 workday. The phrase 9 to 5 has become shorthand for modern employment. It evokes routine, structure, and the predictable rhythm of weekday labor. For many, it represents stability. For others, constraint. Yet the standard workday from 9 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon is not a natural or inevitable division of time. It is the outcome of industrial compromise, shaped by economic pressures, labor activism, and the transformation of production in the modern era. Before industrialization, work was governed largely by daylight, seasons, and task completion. Farmers adjusted their schedules according to weather and harvest cycles. Artisans worked until projects were finished. Time was flexible, measured less by uniform hours and more by necessity. The rise of factories in the 18th and 19th centuries altered this pattern dramatically. Industrial production required synchronization. Machines operated most efficiently when workers were present simultaneously, performing repetitive tasks in coordinated shifts. Early factory conditions were often severe. Workdays could extend 10, 12, or even 16 hours. 6-day workweeks were common. Laborers, including women and children, endured long hours under strict supervision. The concept of a fixed 8-hour day emerged gradually as a response to these conditions. Labor movements in the 19th century began advocating for a balanced division of time summarized in a simple formula: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for personal life. This demand became a central rallying point in the United States and other industrialized nations. Strikes and demonstrations throughout the late 1800s pressured employers to reduce hours. The 8-hour movement was not immediately successful, but it established a powerful framework. Over time, certain industries adopted shorter workdays, particularly as productivity increased with technological advancement. The early 20th century marked a turning point. Industrial efficiency improved, and some business leaders recognized that shorter hours could benefit both workers and companies. In 1914, Henry Ford famously introduced an 8-hour workday for employees at his automobile factories, doubling wages in the process. While not entirely altruistic, the decision reflected a calculation that rested workers were more productive and that higher wages would enable employees to purchase the products they made. Ford's policy influenced broader corporate practice and demonstrated that reduced hours could coexist with profitability. The formal establishment of the 5-day, 40-hour workweek in the United States came with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This legislation limited the standard workweek to 40 hours and required overtime pay beyond that threshold. Although it did not dictate precise daily schedules, the combination of 8-hour days across 5 weekdays gradually solidified into the cultural norm of 9-to-5 employment. The specific timing, from 9 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, reflected practical considerations. Beginning at 9 allowed workers to commute after daylight began. Ending at 5 provided evening hours for family and personal activities. The schedule aligned with banking hours, government offices, and school timetables, reinforcing synchronization across society. Once widely adopted, it structured daily life far beyond the workplace. As economies transitioned from manufacturing to service and knowledge sectors, the material necessity of rigid hours diminished in many fields. Digital communication, remote work, and global connectivity have made continuous production possible without strict temporal boundaries. Yet the 9-to-5 framework persists as a reference point. Even flexible schedules are often described in relation to it. The endurance of the 9-to-5 workday illustrates how institutional agreements shape cultural expectations. What began as a negotiated reform became a social standard. Educational systems prepare students for it. Public transportation systems accommodate it. Media portrayals of professional life assume it. The structure influences housing patterns, urban design, and family routines. At the same time, the phrase carries symbolic weight. It represents not only a schedule but a model of employment tied to stability and predictability. Though many people now work irregular hours, freelance, or operate within gig economies, 9-to-5 remains embedded in language as the archetype of conventional work. The persistence of this model demonstrates how temporal organization can become institutionalized long after its original economic conditions shift. Industrial factories required synchronized labor. Modern digital networks often do not. Yet the pattern endures because it is deeply integrated into legal frameworks, corporate policy, and collective habit. The 9-to-5 workday is therefore not simply a schedule. It is a historical artifact of industrial compromise, carried forward into a transformed economy. Beneath its apparent normality lies a legacy of labor struggle, technological change, and social negotiation. What appears fixed and ordinary is, in fact, the result of deliberate restructuring of time itself. The 2-day weekend. The 2-day weekend feels natural, almost biological, as if the rhythm of 5 days of work followed by 2 days of rest were an inherent human pattern. In reality, this structure is a relatively recent social invention. It emerged from the intersection of religious tradition, industrial economics, and labor negotiation, eventually becoming one of the most stable features of modern life. In pre-industrial societies, there was rarely a uniform concept of a weekend. Agricultural work followed seasonal cycles and daily necessity rather than fixed weekly breaks. Rest days were often tied to religious observance rather than standardized labor policy. In many Christian communities, Sunday was reserved for church and limited activity. In Jewish tradition, Saturday, the Sabbath, was the sacred day of rest. These observances were spiritual obligations rather than universally mandated pauses in economic production. With the rise of industrialization in the 19th century, time became regimented. Factories required consistent attendance, and six-day workweeks were common. Workers typically labored from Monday through Saturday, with Sunday as the only guaranteed day off in predominantly Christian societies. The six-day schedule maximized output while leaving minimal space for leisure. However, in the United States, a diverse workforce brought varying religious practices into industrial settings. Jewish workers often requested time off on Saturday for Sabbath observance, while Christian employers expected attendance on that day but recognized Sunday as sacred. Tensions arose between religious accommodation and industrial efficiency. In the early 20th century, some employers began experimenting with granting a half-day off on Saturday. This arrangement allowed Jewish workers partial observance and provided Christian workers with additional rest. Over time, economic considerations reinforced the appeal of shorter workweeks. As productivity increased through mechanization and improved management practices, companies discovered that reduced hours did not necessarily reduce output proportionally. Henry Ford again played a visible role in normalizing change. In 1926, his company adopted a 5-day, 40-hour workweek, closing factories on both Saturday and Sunday. Ford recognized that workers with more leisure time could become consumers of automobiles and other goods. A 2-day weekend stimulated economic activity beyond the factory floor, creating demand in entertainment, retail, and travel sectors. The Great Depression further accelerated labor reforms. High unemployment and economic instability prompted reevaluation of working hours. By reducing weekly hours, employment could be distributed among more workers. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established the 40-hour workweek as the standard in the United States, requiring overtime pay for additional hours. While the law did not explicitly define Saturday and Sunday as universal days off, the 5-day structure naturally produced a 2-day weekend for most employees. Over time, the weekend became more than a labor policy. It developed cultural significance. Leisure industries expanded around it. Sporting events, shopping patterns, and family activities aligned with the predictable pause in the workweek. Schools structured their calendars accordingly, reinforcing synchronization across generations. Transportation systems adapted to commuter peaks on weekdays and recreational travel on weekends. The 2-day weekend also shaped psychological expectations. People began organizing their lives around anticipation of Friday evening and recovery on Sunday. The week acquired a narrative arc: effort, release, renewal. This rhythm influenced how individuals experienced time, separating professional identity from private life within a regular cycle. Despite globalization and digital connectivity blurring traditional schedules, the 2-day weekend remains deeply embedded in institutional design. Financial markets close on weekends. Government offices operate primarily on weekdays. Corporate systems, customer service hours, and social habits continue to reflect the 5 and 2 division. In some industries, particularly service sectors, the pattern is less uniform. Shift work and continuous operations require staffing beyond Monday through Friday. Even so, compensation structures and scheduling norms often reference the conventional weekend as a baseline. The persistence of the 2-day weekend demonstrates how negotiated compromises can solidify into cultural constants. What began as an accommodation between religious observance and industrial productivity evolved into a central organizing principle of modern society. It regulates not only labor but leisure, commerce, and social interaction. What feels like a natural cadence of work and rest is, in fact, the product of historical adjustment. The 2-day weekend endures because it became structurally integrated into economic systems and collectively internalized as normal. Beneath its familiarity lies a record of industrial transformation and social negotiation that quietly continues to shape the way time is divided in contemporary life. Roman numerals on clocks. Roman numerals on clock faces are a visual tradition that persists long after their practical necessity disappeared. In daily life, most numerical systems rely on Arabic numerals, which are more compact and efficient for calculation. Digital devices display time with precise digits, often down to the second. Yet on many analog clocks, especially decorative or formal ones, the hours are still marked I through 12. The choice reflects continuity with history rather than functional superiority. The use of Roman numerals in timekeeping can be traced to early European clockmaking. Mechanical clocks began appearing in the late Middle Ages, particularly in church towers and public squares. These early timepieces were not merely instruments of measurement. They were civic symbols. Their faces were designed to be legible from a distance and to reflect the cultural authority of classical antiquity, which influenced European art, architecture, and scholarship. Roman numerals, already associated with monumental inscriptions and imperial tradition, conveyed permanence and prestige. As clockmaking advanced during the Renaissance and early modern period, Roman numerals became standard on dials. The 12-hour division aligned naturally with the traditional representation of time, and the numerals provided visual symmetry. Unlike Arabic digits, Roman numerals vary in width and structure, creating a balanced aesthetic around the circular face. The arrangement of I, V, and X forms a repeating pattern that contributes to visual harmony. One distinctive feature often observed on analog clocks is the use of I instead of the expected 4 for the number 4. This variation has been interpreted in several ways. Some historians suggest it was chosen for visual symmetry, balancing the 8 on the opposite side of the dial. Others argue it simplified casting molds or reduced confusion in early manufacturing. Regardless of its origin, the III convention became embedded in clock design and remains common today, illustrating how aesthetic and practical considerations intertwined. The continued presence of Roman numerals on clocks is not driven by efficiency. Arabic numerals are easier to read quickly, particularly in low-light conditions or at small scales. In professional settings such as aviation, navigation, and digital instrumentation, clarity and speed are paramount, and modern numerals dominate. Roman numerals endure primarily in decorative contexts. Grandfather clocks, luxury watches, and architectural timepieces, where tradition carries symbolic weight. Clock faces occupy a unique position in design. They are both functional and ornamental. Unlike digital displays, analog clocks are often integrated into interior decor or public architecture. The use of Roman numerals reinforces a sense of heritage and craftsmanship. It signals continuity with earlier eras, even when the internal mechanism is powered by quartz or electronic components. The persistence of Roman numerals also reflects the conservative nature of horology. Clockmaking developed as a skilled craft, with traditions passed down through generations. Design conventions solidified over centuries, creating expectations about how a clock should appear. Deviating from these norms can feel disruptive, particularly in formal or ceremonial spaces. The numerals are part of a visual language that communicates stability and refinement. In contemporary life, time is measured with extraordinary precision. Atomic clocks regulate global systems. Smartphones synchronize automatically with international standards. Despite this technological complexity, the analog clock face remains an enduring symbol of time itself. Roman numerals contribute to the symbolism by connecting the present to classical antiquity and medieval innovation. Their survival illustrates how design elements can persist when they serve cultural or aesthetic functions, even if their practical advantages diminish. Roman numerals are not necessary for measuring hours, yet they provide a visual narrative. They remind observers that the measurement of time is embedded in history, shaped by earlier civilizations and artistic traditions. What appears to be a simple stylistic choice carries centuries of continuity. Roman numerals on clocks endure not because they are the most efficient way to display numbers, but because they represent a lineage of craftsmanship and cultural memory. In a world increasingly defined by digital precision, The circular dial marked with I through 12 stands as a quiet testament to the enduring influence of historical design. The necktie. The necktie is one of the most recognizable elements of modern formal attire, yet it serves no practical function in contemporary dress. It does not provide warmth, protection, or structural support. It exists as a strip of fabric knotted at the collar, positioned at the center of the torso. Despite its limited utility, it remains a symbol of professionalism, authority, and social convention. Its endurance reflects a long history shaped by military identity, court fashion, and evolving standards of respectability. The origins of the necktie are commonly traced to the 17th century. During the 30 Years' War, Croatian mercenaries serving in France wore distinctive pieces of cloth tied around their necks. These garments were functional in part, securing the collar of their shirts, but they also carried decorative elements. French observers took notice of this style. The garment became known as the cravat, derived from the French pronunciation of croat. Over time, the cravat was adopted into French aristocratic fashion, transforming from military accessory into a refined symbol of status. In the courts of Europe, clothing signaled hierarchy and sophistication. The cravat evolved into elaborate arrangements of lace and linen, carefully tied and maintained. It indicated refinement and adherence to social norms. As fashion shifted in the 18th and 19th centuries, the ornate cravat gradually gave way to simpler neckwear styles. Industrialization and urbanization altered dress codes, favoring practicality and standardization over decorative excess. By the 19th century, the modern necktie began to take shape. The rise of the business class introduced new expectations of appearance. Men working in offices, finance, and administration adopted suits as a uniform of professionalism. The necktie complemented this ensemble, providing a focal point that conveyed order and discipline. Unlike earlier decorative cravats, the tie was streamlined, easier to produce, and suited to the structured lines of tailored jackets. The Industrial Revolution also influenced textile manufacturing. Advances in weaving and dyeing allowed for mass production of patterned fabrics. Neckties became accessible beyond aristocratic circles, spreading across social classes. As corporate culture expanded in the 20th century, the tie became embedded in the image of the white-collar worker. It symbolized seriousness and conformity within institutional environments. Despite its symbolic weight, the necktie has always been somewhat impractical. It restricts airflow around the neck, requires manual adjustment, and serves no protective function. In some industrial settings, it was even discouraged for safety reasons. Yet within offices, courtrooms, and diplomatic events, it remained standard. Its presence signaled adherence to professional codes rather than comfort. The tie's persistence illustrates how clothing can function as a social signal detached from original purpose. What began as a military garment adopted for courtly display transformed into a marker of corporate identity. Over time, the act of tying a knot became ritualized, associated with preparation and readiness. The symmetrical shape resting against the shirt front came to represent composure and control. In recent decades, dress codes have relaxed in many sectors. Technology companies and creative industries often favor casual attire. The tie has retreated from everyday use in certain contexts, yet it continues to appear in formal ceremonies, politics, finance, and law. During official addresses or high-level negotiations, it remains part of the visual language of authority. The design of the modern tie also reflects continuity with tradition. Its standard length and tapered shape are the result of incremental refinements dating back over a century. Variations in color and pattern allow for personal expression within a structured framework, balancing individuality with conformity. The necktie endures because it carries accumulated meaning. It signals participation in a long-established system of expectations. Even as its functional justification has faded, its symbolic role remains intact. It connects contemporary professional life to centuries of evolving fashion and social hierarchy. What appears to be a simple accessory is, in fact, a cultural artifact. The necktie survives not because it is necessary, but because it communicates belonging within established institutions. Its fabric may be modern, but its lineage traces through military fields, royal courts, and industrial offices. In that continuity lies the reason it still rests at the center of formal dress. The dial phone gesture. The gesture of rotating a finger in the air to suggest making a phone call persists as a cultural reflex, even though the mechanism it imitates has largely disappeared. The word dial itself belongs to an earlier era of telecommunication, when placing a call required turning a circular device embedded in the face of a telephone. Today, numbers are tapped on touchscreens or selected from contact lists, yet the language and the gesture remain rooted in the mechanical past. Rotary dial telephones became common in the early 20th century as automated switching systems replaced manual operators. Earlier calls required speaking to an operator who physically connected lines at a switchboard. With the introduction of rotary dialing, users could directly input numbers themselves. The circular dial featured 10 finger holes corresponding to digits. To enter a number, the user inserted a finger into the appropriate hole, rotated the dial clockwise until it stopped, and released it. The dial then returned to its original position with a controlled clicking sound, sending electrical pulses that encoded the selected digit. This process was tactile and deliberate. Each number required a full rotation and release, creating a rhythm unique to rotary telephones. The physical effort reinforced awareness of the act of calling. The circular dial itself became visually synonymous with telephony, appearing in advertisements, films, and domestic interiors. The gesture of rotating a finger came to symbolize communication at a distance. As push-button telephones emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, the mechanical dial was replaced by a keypad. Instead of generating pulses through rotary motion, these phones used tone signaling, producing distinct audio frequencies for each digit. The process became faster and quieter. Users pressed buttons rather than turning a wheel. Despite this shift, the word dial continued to describe the act of entering a number. The vocabulary remained unchanged even as the physical action transformed. The arrival of mobile phones further abstracted the process. Keypads shrank, and eventually touchscreens replaced physical buttons altogether. Many calls no longer require manual number entry at all. Contacts are selected from stored lists. The interface is graphical, and the connection is established through complex digital networks. No mechanical motion resembles the circular movement of the original dial. Yet the gesture persists. In casual conversation, people still mime a rotary motion to indicate calling someone. In film and television, the gesture functions as a visual shorthand for communication. Even the icon representing a phone in many applications retains the silhouette of a traditional handset, despite the fact that modern devices no longer resemble that form. The survival of the dial gesture illustrates how embodied actions can outlast the technologies that created them. When a movement is repeated across generations, it becomes encoded in cultural memory. Children observed adults rotating dials and absorbed the gesture as part of communicative behavior. Even when they grew up using different devices, the symbolic motion retained meaning. Language reinforces this continuity. Expressions such as dial a number or speed dial remain standard. Even though no dial is physically involved, the words function independently of their mechanical origin. They provide stability in a rapidly changing technological landscape. This phenomenon reflects a broader pattern in technological evolution. Interfaces change, but metaphors endure. Designers often preserve familiar language to reduce confusion and ease transitions between systems. Retaining the word dial ensured continuity as telephones evolved from rotary mechanisms to digital networks. The persistence of the gesture also underscores the human tendency to associate communication with physical action. Even in an age of invisible signals and wireless transmission, symbolic movements provide tangible anchors. The rotary motion suggests connection, effort, and intention. It embodies the initiation of contact. The dial phone gesture is therefore more than nostalgic mimicry. It is a cultural residue of early automation in communication technology. Though the circular dial has disappeared from most households, its motion survives in language, media, and everyday expression. What once operated through gears and pulses now travels as digital data, Yet the memory of turning a wheel remains embedded in how people imagine the act of calling. Uppercase and lowercase letters. The terms uppercase and lowercase are so embedded in modern language that they feel abstract, almost grammatical by nature. We use them to describe capital and small letters, to indicate emphasis, proper nouns, or stylistic preference. Yet the origin of these words lies not in linguistics but in the physical organization of early printing workshops. They are remnants of a material system that shaped written communication for centuries. Before the invention of the printing press, texts were copied by hand. Scribes often used larger, more ornate letters to begin sentences or paragraphs, while smaller script filled the body of the text. These visual distinctions helped structure manuscripts. However, the terminology uppercase and lowercase did not emerge until movable type transformed the production of books in the 15th century. With the spread of printing technology in Europe, individual letters were cast as separate metal blocks called type. Printers stored these pieces in wooden cases divided into compartments. Each compartment held multiple copies of a specific letter. Because capital letters were used less frequently than small letters, they required fewer individual blocks. Printers arranged their workstations accordingly. The less frequently used capital letters were placed in a case position above the main workspace, while the more common small letters were stored in a larger case below. Over time, this practical arrangement generated descriptive terminology. The capital letters were located in the uppercase, and the smaller letters in the lowercase. The distinction referred to physical location rather than grammatical category. Compositors assembling text would reach upward to select a capital letter and downward for the smaller forms. The language of the workshop became the language of writing. As printing expanded and literacy increased, these terms spread beyond the trade. Readers and writers adopted the vocabulary without direct exposure to the printing process. The physical cases eventually disappeared with the advent of mechanical typesetting machines and, later, digital typography. Yet the terminology endured, detached from the wooden drawers that inspired it. The persistence of uppercase and lowercase illustrates how technical infrastructure can shape linguistic convention. Modern keyboards retain a shift key that toggles between capital and small letters, a digital echo of reaching between cases. The conceptual separation remains embedded in education systems, style guides, and programming languages. Beyond terminology, the distinction between capital and small letters serves structural and symbolic purposes. Capitals signal beginnings, proper nouns, and emphasis. Small letters dominate continuous text, creating visual flow. This division enhances readability and organizes information. However, its naming continues to reference a workshop environment that most users have never encountered. The history of uppercase and lowercase letters also reflects the standardization of language. Early printed books contributed to stabilizing spelling and formatting across regions. Printers established conventions about when to use capital letters, shaping grammar and orthography. The physical arrangement of type influenced editorial decisions that became formal rules. In contemporary digital environments, typography is fluid and programmable. Fonts can be resized, transformed, or generated algorithmically. Letters exist as data rather than metal blocks. There is no upper drawer or lower compartment. Nevertheless, the conceptual framework remains unchanged. Writers still shift between uppercase and lowercase, often without awareness of the term's literal origin. This endurance highlights the continuity between mechanical and digital systems. Modern word processors are distant descendants of printing presses. Though the tools have evolved, they preserve structural logic inherited from earlier technologies. The vocabulary of uppercase and lowercase is a linguistic artifact of that lineage. What appears to be a purely grammatical distinction carries the memory of physical labor. The simple act of pressing a key to capitalize a letter is linked historically to printers sorting metal type in wooden cases. The terminology survived because it was useful, descriptive, and widely adopted. Even as the material conditions vanished, the language remained intact. Uppercase and lowercase letters are therefore more than stylistic categories. They are traces of a workshop culture embedded within modern writing. Beneath everyday digital text lies a history of craftsmanship and organization that continues to shape how language is structured and understood. Why school buses are yellow. The yellow color of school buses in the United States is so familiar that it feels inevitable. Generations of students have associated that specific shade with morning routines, safety, and the structure of the school day. Yet the choice was not arbitrary, nor was it purely aesthetic. It emerged from a deliberate effort in the early 20th century to standardize and improve student transportation across the country. Before the 1930s, school transportation varied widely. Rural districts often relied on modified trucks or privately owned vehicles to carry children to school. There was no uniform design, no consistent safety requirements, and no standardized color. Vehicles ranged in size and appearance, sometimes blending indistinguishably into ordinary traffic. As compulsory education expanded and rural populations required organized transport, the need for consistency became apparent. In 1939, a pivotal conference was held at Teachers College, Columbia University, bringing together educators, transportation officials, and industry representatives. The goal was to establish national standards for school buses, covering everything from structural specifications to safety features. Among the decisions made was the adoption of a uniform color intended to maximize visibility and recognition. The chosen shade became known as National School Bus Glossy Yellow, sometimes informally referred to as school bus yellow. The selection was grounded in research about human vision. Yellow is one of the most visible colors in peripheral vision and in low-light conditions. The human eye is particularly sensitive to yellow wavelengths, allowing the color to stand out against natural backgrounds such as trees, buildings, and cloudy skies. Black lettering placed on a yellow background provides strong contrast, making the word school bus legible from a distance. Visibility was not merely a matter of aesthetics but of safety. Children boarding and exiting buses required protection from passing traffic. A highly distinctive vehicle increased the likelihood that drivers would recognize and respond appropriately. The standardized color made school buses immediately identifiable, even before the development of flashing lights and stop arms that are common today. Standardization also fostered uniformity across states and districts. When buses shared the same appearance nationwide, motorists could associate the color with specific rules and expectations. Over time, laws were enacted requiring drivers to stop when a school bus displayed warning signals. The color became embedded in traffic regulations and public awareness campaigns. The adoption of yellow coincided with other safety reforms. The conference established specifications for body construction, seating, and emergency exits. By defining these standards, organizers aimed to transform school transportation from an improvised service into a regulated system. The uniform color became a visible symbol of that transformation. As decades passed, the yellow bus became part of American cultural identity. It appears in films, literature, and public imagery as a marker of childhood and education. Its color is instantly recognizable, even in stylized illustrations. Few other vehicles are so consistently associated with a single function. Technological advancements have altered the mechanics of buses, improving engines, braking systems, and safety features. Reflective materials and advanced lighting now enhance visibility beyond color alone. Yet the original shade remains unchanged. Its continued use demonstrates the durability of effective design choices once they become institutionalized. The yellow school bus illustrates how research, regulation, and public policy can converge to create lasting standards. What began as a practical decision grounded in visual science evolved into a national convention. The color is not merely tradition. It is the product of deliberate evaluation of safety and recognition. Today, when a yellow bus approaches, drivers instinctively understand its significance. The color signals caution and responsibility. Its familiarity reinforces compliance with traffic laws and awareness of children's presence. The effectiveness of this visual cue depends on its consistency across communities. The endurance of school bus yellow reveals how design decisions can shape collective behavior over generations. Beneath its bright surface lies a history of coordination and reform aimed at protecting students. What appears to be a simple paint choice is, in fact, a carefully considered standard that continues to guide daily routines and public safety across the nation. The bride's white dress. The white wedding dress is widely perceived as an ancient symbol of purity and tradition. In much of the Western world, it feels timeless, almost inseparable from the image of marriage itself. Yet the dominance of white bridal gowns is a relatively modern development, shaped less by sacred ritual than by fashion, royal influence, and social signaling. Before the 19th century, brides did not typically wear white. In Europe and North America, wedding attire varied according to region, culture, and economic circumstance. Most brides simply wore their best dress, regardless of color. For many families, clothing represented a significant investment, and practicality outweighed symbolism. Dresses were chosen for durability and future use rather than for a single ceremonial occasion. Darker colors, including blue, brown, or even black, were common because they were easier to maintain and could be worn again. The turning point occurred in 1840 with the marriage of Queen Victoria to Prince Albert. Victoria chose to wear a white silk gown trimmed with lace, a decision that diverged from the ornate, heavily jeweled royal attire typical of the time. Her choice was widely publicized in newspapers and illustrated prints. Because she was a reigning monarch at the height of Britain's global influence, her fashion decisions carried cultural weight. The white dress was perceived not only as elegant but as modern and refined. Importantly, Victoria's gown was not explicitly framed as a symbol of purity in its original context. Instead, it showcased British lace craftsmanship and reflected contemporary aesthetic preferences. However, as images of the wedding circulated, white began to acquire new associations. The color suggested simplicity and virtue within Victorian moral culture. Over time, these meanings became intertwined with the ritual of marriage. As industrialization expanded textile production in the late 19th century, white fabrics became more accessible to the middle class. Improvements in laundering techniques and the availability of bleaching agents made maintaining white garments more practical. The color gradually transitioned from a display of wealth, since keeping a white dress clean required resources, to a broader aspirational norm. By the early 20th century, bridal fashion magazines and department stores reinforced the expectation of white gowns. Advertising campaigns standardized the image of the bride as dressed in white, accompanied by veils and floral arrangements. The wedding industry, increasingly commercialized, amplified these conventions. What began as a royal fashion choice solidified into a social standard. The symbolic interpretation of white as purity gained prominence in later narratives. Religious and cultural traditions were reinterpreted to align with the emerging fashion norm. Although purity had long been associated with marriage in various ways, the specific linkage between white gowns and moral virtue was strengthened retrospectively. The dress became a visual shorthand for innocence and ceremonial solemnity. In reality, bridal attire has always reflected cultural diversity. In many societies outside Western Europe and North America, red, gold, or other vibrant colors remain traditional for weddings. The predominance of white is largely a Western convention, later exported globally through media, colonial influence, and international fashion trends. Despite shifts in contemporary attitudes toward marriage and gender roles, the white wedding dress remains remarkably resilient. Designers reinterpret its silhouette, fabric, and detail, but the color endures as a default expectation. Even brides who choose alternative shades often define their choice in relation to the white norm. The endurance of the white dress illustrates how fashion can transform into perceived tradition within a few generations. A single influential event, amplified by media and industry, reshaped cultural practice. Over time, repetition created the illusion of antiquity. The gown's color, once a modern statement, became emblematic of timelessness. Today, when a bride appears in white, few consider the historical contingency of that choice. The dress seems inevitable, embedded in the ceremony's visual language. Yet its dominance is the result of social influence, technological change, and commercial reinforcement rather than ancient decree. The white wedding dress persists because it carries accumulated meaning. It signifies continuity with generations past, even though its widespread adoption began less than 2 centuries ago. Beneath the layers of fabric lies a story of monarchy, media, and modernization, an example of how fashion can crystallize into tradition and endure long after its original context fades. The Rule of 72 in finance. The Rule of 72 is one of the simplest and most enduring shortcuts in financial thinking. It offers a quick way to estimate how long it will take for an investment to double in value, given a fixed annual rate of return. By dividing 72 by the interest rate, one obtains an approximate number of years required for doubling. For example, at a 6% annual return, an investment will double in roughly 12 years. The calculation is not exact, but it is remarkably close for many common rates. The rule's longevity is striking in an era defined by financial software, calculators, and algorithmic forecasting. Its appeal lies in its clarity. It transforms the abstract concept of compound interest into an intuitive mental estimate. Rather than relying on complex formulas, investors can perform the calculation quickly, even without written tools. The mathematical foundation of the Rule of 72 is rooted in logarithms and exponential growth. Compound interest follows an exponential curve, meaning that growth accelerates over time as interest accumulates on both principal and prior interest. The precise doubling time can be calculated using natural logarithms. However, such calculations are impractical for mental arithmetic. The number 72 functions as a convenient approximation because it is highly composite, divisible by many small integers such as 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, and 12. This flexibility makes division straightforward across a wide range of interest rates. The origins of the rule date back centuries. Variations of the concept appeared in Renaissance mathematics, when scholars began analyzing compound growth more systematically. One of the earliest known references is attributed to the Italian mathematician Luca Pacioli in the late 15th century. At a time when commerce and banking were expanding across Europe, practical tools for understanding interest were increasingly valuable. Over time, the Rule of 72 became embedded in financial education. It appears in textbooks, investment seminars, and advisory materials. Its endurance reflects not only mathematical convenience but also pedagogical effectiveness. The rule communicates a powerful idea. Small differences in interest rates can produce significant differences in long-term outcomes. By illustrating how quickly capital can double under varying returns, it encourages attention to compounding. The rule is most accurate for interest rates between approximately 6 and 10%. At lower or higher rates, the approximation becomes less precise, though it remains directionally informative. Despite its limitations, its simplicity often outweighs minor inaccuracies. In practical decision-making, understanding general magnitude can be more valuable than exact figures. Beyond personal investing, the Rule of 72 has broader applications. It can estimate the time required for debt to double under high interest rates, highlighting the risks of compounding liabilities. It can also approximate how long it takes for inflation to erode purchasing power. By dividing 72 by the inflation rate, one can estimate the years required for prices to double, illustrating the long-term impact of monetary change. The rule's survival into the digital age demonstrates how certain intellectual tools retain value despite technological advancement. Modern finance relies on sophisticated models and real-time analytics, yet this centuries-old approximation continues to circulate because it provides immediate insight. It bridges the gap between abstract mathematics and everyday financial intuition. Its continued use also reflects the human preference for heuristics, mental shortcuts that simplify complex processes. While precise calculations are available instantly on digital devices, the Rule of 72 offers independence from tools. It allows individuals to grasp exponential growth without external assistance, reinforcing understanding rather than mere computation. In contemporary culture, where financial literacy is often uneven, the rule serves as an accessible entry point into the mechanics of compounding. It encapsulates a fundamental principle of wealth accumulation and debt expansion within a single, memorable number. The fact that it has persisted for more than 5 centuries underscores its practical elegance. The Rule of 72 endures not because it is perfectly exact, but because it translates complexity into clarity. It carries forward a tradition of mathematical approximation that predates modern finance, reminding us that even in an age of advanced calculation, simple insights can retain lasting power. Why we knock on wood. The phrase knock on wood is something many people say almost automatically. You mention a piece of good luck, avoid a disaster, or talk about how well things are going, and then you quickly tap on a table. Feels small and harmless, almost playful. But this simple gesture has surprisingly deep roots in history and human psychology. One of the oldest explanations traces back to ancient pagan cultures in Europe. Many early societies believed that trees were inhabited by spirits or divine beings. In Celtic traditions, sacred groves were places of worship, and trees like oak were seen as powerful and protective. Touching or knocking on wood was thought to either call upon the spirit within the tree for protection or to thank it for good fortune. The act wasn't symbolic, it was literal. People believed something lived there. Another theory suggests that knocking on wood was meant to ward off evil spirits. If you spoke too confidently about your good luck, you might attract jealousy from supernatural forces. Knocking on wood created a sound that would scare away these spirits before they could interfere. In this sense, the gesture acted as a kind of spiritual reset button. As Christianity spread across Europe, the meaning evolved. Some connected the act to the wood of the cross of Jesus Christ, believing that touching would invoke divine protection. Whether this interpretation came before or after the pagan versions is debated, but it shows how older customs often blend into newer belief systems rather than disappearing completely. Psychologically, the habit still serves a purpose today. Humans dislike uncertainty. Even in modern societies that rely on science and logic, we still feel uncomfortable admitting that we can't control everything. Knocking on wood gives a tiny illusion of control. It reduces anxiety in situations where outcomes are uncertain. It's similar to other everyday superstitions. Crossing fingers, avoiding walking under ladders, or carrying a lucky object. What makes this ritual interesting is that most people who use it don't actually believe spirits live in trees. The meaning has faded, but the behavior remains. It survives because it satisfies something emotional rather than rational. It's quick, harmless, and socially understood. When someone says, "Business has been great this year," knock on wood, everyone instantly understands the intent. I hope this continues. In the end, knocking on wood isn't about magic. It's about managing hope and fear in a world that feels unpredictable. A simple tap on a desk connects us to ancient traditions, religious symbolism, and modern psychology, all in a single, almost unconscious motion. Ending. Today we learned that even something as simple as knocking on would carry centuries of history, from ancient tree spirits to modern psychology. A tiny gesture, but a powerful reminder of how humans deal with luck, fear, and uncertainty. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit the like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this video with your friends. You never know who might knock on wood next.